Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Alex podcast. It's summer, traditionally a bleak time for the news media as our politicians go on holiday and very little happens in the turbulent world of Scottish politics, which instead, after the usual turbulence anyway, is now in the doldrums. But if it's summer, that also means it's time for a new prospectus, a new plan for independence. This has become a traditional part of the Scottish summer season, normally coming just after Wimbledon and before the 12th of July. And John Swinney has delivered on this. Like his predecessors, Humza Yousaf and Nicola Sturgeon, he has announced a new plan for independence and how the SNP may take the people of Scotland to the promised land. We'll consider that. We'll also consider how the Conservative Party are faring with Kemi Badenoch's reshuffle this week, and turbulence again in the Scottish Greens with accusations of malpractice when it comes to the selections of their candidates for the regional list for next year's Holyrood elections. We'll have a little dip into the world of the Greens as well. But Bernard, first things first, John Swinney, new plan for independence. Is it a real plan?
Well,
can it work? What did you make of it?
When is a strategy for independence not a strategy for independence? When it's proposed by the First Minister would be my sort of take on this. This renewed approach, which I'm not so sure is a renewed approach, appears to have three prongs to it. First of all, he wants the party to win high levels of support for independence. Oh, knock me down with a feather. That's all a bit obvious. Secondly, he wants pressure around the right to decide. This is to get over the issue of the Supreme Court saying that the route is perfectly clear. It has to be a consented process by both parliaments. He wants pressure around the right to decide in the first place. And thirdly, he's saying that a win at the Holyrood election would help the cause of independence. Now, those are the three prongs, but I would suggest that that does not amount to a strategy in independence. What it does do is that it, first of all, means that he's talking about independence. What it means is that some of his activists who are impatient at the fact that the party doesn't appear to be pressing the case for independence will be a little happier. But in no sense does it actually deal with the issues of some within the broader Yes movement to say that the only way in which you can actually move the argument on is to have a common front at the elections next May, where all of the pro-independence parties would effectively pledge to explicitly seek the support of the voters in order to pursue independence. And frankly, what the three prongs do is that they're just basic discussion points on a strategy. They don't actually amount to a strategy. Swinney is not saying, for example, vote for the SNP at the elections next year, and we will regard that as a mandate to negotiate independence. And if there are 65 MSPs in the Parliament who support independence and who have stood on a manifesto committing themselves to open up the independence question with Westminster, then we would get the authority from the people to do that. Now, setting aside that the Scotland Act has a specific route in order to get to a second referendum, nevertheless, if a new Scottish government were to put that centre stage unambiguously at an election, post the election, if the figures work in his favour, he could legitimately say, this is back on the agenda, we wish to talk about that. But that's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying at all. And that is what some people within the broader Yes movement would like him to say. They would like the idea of a common front approach among the pro-independence parties. So what this is the classic example of smoke and mirrors politics. And it's really about saying, this hasn't gone off the boil. I lead a party of independence. I haven't forgotten about independence, you know. Well, in a sense, he has, because he's not come forward with a strategy which explains to people how you get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the broader context in which next year's election takes place and the reality with which John Swinney and indeed Kate Forbes and everybody else in the SNP has to grapple is that, support for independence as a notional hypothetical matter remains pretty solid. In the opinion polls, it runs pretty consistently, somewhere between 45 and 50%, generally speaking. Support for the SNP, however, is now down at around between 30 and 35%. And so seems to me quite clear that the SNP can be the largest party in the Scottish Parliament on 35% of the vote, but it has no kind of mandate, moral or arithmetical, to pursue independence on 35% of the vote. And that is the case regardless of how many seats it wins. And so for the SNP and for the First Minister, closing the gap between support for the SNP and support for independence is absolutely crucial for the nationalists in the longer term. But within that, it seems to me that if you were launching a real strategy for independence, you would not do so at the start of the parliamentary recess. You would not do so at a time when everybody is on holiday. And SNP First Ministers have been here before. 2 years ago, Hamza Yusuf announced a great independence convention and a series of assemblies around the country, talking shops that produced nothing of any value or merit whatsoever. Go back as far as, I think it was 2016, Nicola Sturgeon announced a Summer of Independence, a proposition, the seriousness of which we could judge from the fact that it was to be led by Stuart Hosey, who has not, I think, managed to ever someone who was likely to rally the people, shall we say. So to some extent, these maneuvers are going through the motions, it seems to me. But at the same time, John Swinney wants to escape from the shadow cast by Nicola Sturgeon in particular, because if you recall, when she talked about turning elections into a de facto referendum, she raised the bar for success for the SNP to almost impossible heights, because suddenly to have any kind of mandate, you wouldn't just need most seats, more seats than any other party, or even a majority of the seats. You would need a majority of the votes cast if it was to be a de facto referendum, which is something that has no legal or constitutional significance whatsoever. But nevertheless, it seems to me that is something that that Conservative and Labour politicians will hold the SNP to in the future. That you once set the bar this high, now you want to lower it. I don't think you can do that, can you?
Well, on the issue of the polls, there is a credibility gap, and the credibility gap is that there are many people in Scotland who like the idea of independence, but they don't like the record of the SNP government, and there is a very, very clear gap there. I think that my analysis of this is simply that post 2014, there are people within the Yes movement who would have said, "Look, we lost, and that's fine." Democracy takes its course. We've lost. But there have been a whole series of people who were energized around the last referendum, who, in a sense, became engaged with politics for the first time during the course of that referendum. And indeed, the membership of the SNP went up beyond over 120,000 members. Look where it is now. It is not unreasonable to conclude that there was a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of foot soldiers who were recruited to this idea in the immediate aftermath of a defeat, who have now left the stage. And therefore, those people within the broader Yes movement will say, why is it that 60,000 people in Scotland who signed up to a party of independence, who were ready to campaign in communities to take the argument forward, have now exited the stage? Well, they could have exited the stage for a whole series of reasons. I suspect, and a lot of people will have exited the stage because they join a political party, not really knowing how political parties operate, and think these people are all fighting with one another. This is not why I join. I don't like that. But undoubtedly, some people will have left because they essentially were impatient about any lack of a strategy. And there is no doubt in that sense that Nicola Sturgeon kicked the can down the road, did very little, then come out with sort of convoluted strategies. And what is needed from the point of view of the SNP is a very, very clear route. it is incumbent on John Swinney to explain to his own people what the route is. And saying that we have to win high levels of support, we have to maximize pressure around the right to decide, and winning an election at Holyrood would help, is not a route map to independence.
No, but then there isn't a map. I mean, this is the problem that lots of people, I think, on the yes side struggle with, and the reality that they find difficult to accept.
Well, there's a
which is
constitutional roadmap, and it's called the Scotland Act. And if the SNP don't accept the current what the Scotland Act says on that, upheld by the Supreme Court, then they're perfectly entitled to say, we wish to campaign to change the terms of that act because we believe in practical terms it denies people the right to decide, which is Swinney's second point. But I come back to the point, this renewed approach does not make a strategy and does not make a roadmap.
No, it doesn't. But then, it's also an acceptance of the fact that at the moment, whether people like it or not, the salience of the constitutional question, of the national question, has declined significantly. It is not a top 2 or 3 order of concern for voters right now. That may change in the future. It may well be that there is another nationalist wave that breaks even higher up the beach than previous ones. But at the moment, there isn't any such movement or momentum for the cause of independence. And there is a sort of assumption, it seems to me, within the yes movement and so on, that people are entitled to a second referendum. But there is no obvious case for that. I mean, the case for a referendum, for a second referendum, it seems to me, has to be vastly stronger than the case for a first referendum on precisely the same question. I think people who are opposed to the SNP and to independence are perfectly entitled to say, but we've had a referendum. Scotland has had the right to choose, and it chose. The fact you didn't like the result, you didn't like the choice that people made, doesn't mean that there has to be a second referendum.
Well, that was 10 years ago, and
Well,
there's a lot of politics under the bridge in the last 10 years.
well, yeah, absolutely.
But
That's what John Swinney would say.
You and I disagree on one fundamental issue. We've already had this disagreement in the past. There is a difference between whether or not you believe that independence is a good thing or a bad thing, and whether or not you think the country should have the right to decide. Now, of course, there is a constitutional mechanism in the Scotland Act. It was used the last time around. Any Westminster, I bet you if Mr. Farage was Prime Minister, he might like the idea of saying, yeah, go and have a second referendum and I hope you win it. That'll get all of you off our backs. But the fact is that in the absence of Swinney spelling out what he considers a mandate, in a sense, it doesn't really matter. Because if he doesn't seek a mandate at an election, then he can hardly claim one if the result goes the right way. You cannot, for example, this is not, in my view, going to happen. But let's say, for example, the SNP have a stonkingly good result next year. And in combination with other parties, they're way over the 65 seats. It would not, in my view, be credible to say we've won the election and we've won it handsomely. We want a second referendum if there's nothing in his manifesto which seeks a mandate for that. So it gets back to first principles. What's he going to put in the manifesto? What is he going to seek support for? Because this renewed approach is just about making arguments over strategy and arguments over independence. It's not about saying to people, if you vote SNP in the election, here is what I will specifically do in relation to independence the day after we win an election. So when is a strategy for independence not a strategy for independence? It would appear when it's written by the First Minister.
Well, yeah, but I mean, to a certain extent, we're back where we were in 2015 when there was an acceptance, and I think John Swinney was at the heart of this acceptance within the SNP. That look, the only way we can actually put this question again, is when it is absolutely clear that that's what the people of Scotland want, and that is to be measured by, as they've said at the time, and one can bring it back now because it seems to me to be just as relevant now, when there is, say, 60% support for independence over a prolonged period of time, as measured in opinion polls and elections and all the rest of it. And we are nowhere near
Well,
that.
that's
If there
arbitrary.
were to be a second referendum, it seems to me that it should be much better for the country, as well as for everything else. If it is a referendum that were to confirm what the people of Scotland want rather than to determine what they want. And we are nowhere close to that. But I think, you have plenty of people on the unionist side and so on who would be very unhappy if that was what the clear wish of the Scottish people was, but they wouldn't oppose it. You have people like Michael Gove, for instance, was talking recently about how, if it was the clear and settled will of the Scottish people, then, well, so be it. We would accept that. But we're nowhere close to that kind of situation arising just now. And that's why, I agree with you. I
Well,
think this is a fake strategy for a fake notion of independence. But
we're nowhere near that, because if the main party of independence isn't giving a clear strategy about how to get there, then you're going to ask yourself the perennial question: how do you judge whether or not there's support for it? I mean, if the SNP go into the election, don't have a roadmap, don't seek a mandate to pursue a particular strategy, then it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen because there's no demand for it. And there's going to be no demand for it because the SNP will not have sought a mandate to pursue a particular strategy.
yeah, but you can't impose a desire for independence on the people, and you can't unilaterally determine what the meaning of an election result is and so on in advance of that election taking place. So they're stuck. They're in the doldrums, in no man's land, and all they can do is wait. It's waiting for Godot and so on, and hoping that independence turns up at some point. But it will only do so when the people are ready to think about it. And it seems to me at the moment, and recent election results and so on seem to demonstrate this too, that there isn't any overwhelming desire amongst the people of Scotland at present to reopen the constitutional question. And until such time as there is that clear and settled will and so on, I can't see how you can have any kind of strategy that actually means anything, that is actually deliverable.
Well, we're not disagreeing on that point, because if the SNP are not offering a strategy, then it's pretty difficult to start measuring in electoral terms. But one party which is absolutely desperate for the SNP to give a very clear roadmap and to campaign unambiguously next May is the Tories, because the Scottish Tories would dearly love the election next May to be a de facto referendum on the Constitution. I mean, the Scottish Tories, I think we're both agreed that are probably headed for a pretty poor result next May. The Tories, of course, did get a significant bounce following the last referendum, when electoral attitudes hardened around constitutional choices made in 2014. Now that has dissipated and gone away, they're now, I think, fighting to remain relevant, but also fighting to remain relevant in UK terms. And that brings us on to Kemi Badenoch's reshuffle yesterday. Will it do any good? My view on this, Alex, is that it won't do any good. I noticed. I noticed.
Right, next
I
question.
next. I when James Cleverley is your headline, when James Cleverley is your headline, you know that you're probably in some trouble. For those and for the purposes of getting every point of view, I do delve into the right wing newspapers and do read the right wing commentators. I mean, my view of the Tories is that they are probably finished for the rest of this parliament, and that they're going to have an absolutely miserable time of it at the next general election. I do not subscribe to the view, which is on many right-wing commentators, they write about, are the Tories facing an existential crisis, and is the party finished? I mean, people are writing about the Conservatives now the way that many commentators on the left wrote about the Labour Party in the early 1980s. And it was Margaret Thatcher herself who, even at the high point of the SDP Liberal Alliance, when they were polling 50% of the vote in the opinion polls, far higher than Reform are polling now, who simply said the Labour Party will be a long time a-dying. And that is equally true, I think, of the Conservatives. That being said, I think they're finished for this Parliament. I think they're finished for this Parliament because their front bench is stunningly unimpressive. I don't think their leader is capable of carving a distinct agenda which will wean Conservative voters off Reform. And a little bit like the Scottish Tories, they're simply going to have to accept their medicine and wait for the political winds to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that there is anything that Kemi Badenoch can do that will persuade people to abandon reform. You know, it's not in her gift, and so on. Uh, uh, what will determine reform's fortunes to some extent is the performance of Nigel Farage and so on. And it's quite interesting. You now see Farage actually being asked about policy, as though he could be a political insider rather than just an outsider, which has been his role previously, and so on. And so the question becomes, well, Mr. Farage, were you to be in office and so on, what would you actually do? And you immediately see that Farage doesn't actually have any answers to this, and so he has a combination of massive tax cuts and massive spending increases. Because Farage has to play the game at both ends, if you like. He needs to target Labour voters in the so-called Red Wall and other constituencies of that sort south of the border, while at the same time targeting disgruntled Conservative voters, particularly in the south and southeast of England and places like Lincolnshire, who are attracted to the idea of lower taxes, lower immigration, obviously, lower spending on welfare, at the same time as he is promising to massively increase spending on the state pension and various other things to appeal to those Labour voters that he wants to attract. And, so the reform agenda is utterly contradictory. And at some point, it seems to me that voters will begin to pay attention to that, that there is a difference between flirting with reform and marrying reform. And I, might well end up being proved completely wrong about this, of course, but it seems to me that just as the SDP Liberal Alliance was in some ways a storm throughout much of the 1980s that eventually blew itself out, so it seems to me that something similar is quite possible with reform. And that as and when that happens, which may well not be until after the next election, I fully concede that there then becomes a space and an opportunity for a revived and rethought Conservative Party to reassert itself as the primary force on the right of centre of British politics. But, that it doesn't seem to me terribly likely that Kemi Badenoch will be the leader able to take advantage of of that moment for Conservative renewal. She is in some ways, a sort of a lame duck leader, and the people that she beat, James Cleverley, most notably perhaps, in the race to become leader of the Conservative Party, the people she beat have every reason to be grateful for the fact they lost to Badenoch, it seems to me, because there is a time and a season for everything in politics and a time and a season for leadership. And it is Kemi Badenoch's ill fortune to preside over the Conservative Party at a time when nobody is interested in hearing from the Conservative Party. And there is nothing it can do, even in the face of a lackluster and often disappointing government with which people have lost patience already in certain respects. There is nothing the Conservatives can really do to seize the commanding heights of British politics right now and command attention as a genuine alternative to Keir Starmer, because the time just isn't right for it.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up your point about the SDP Liberal Alliance, I mean, as I said in my last answer, there were occasions, particularly between the formation of the SDP in March of 81 and up until the 83 election, where their poll ratings were much, much higher than Reform. And it's instructive, and again, I think this is an important point to make, and it's one Reform will probably experience at the next general election. In both the 83 election and the 87 election, and I had occasion to to double check this the other week. The share of the vote that the Alliance got was about 2 percentage points behind the Labour Party in both 1983 and in 1987. So they were polling 25% of the vote. Now, assuming that when you get to a general election situation, it's reasonable to assume that when policies are put under the microscope and you have scrutiny and all the rest of it, and people are not making a protest and they have to elect a government, reform polling 25% of the vote at the next general election would be a significant thing in politics. But here's the rub. Again, if we go back to the lessons of the 1980s, you do not break the mold of politics on 25% of the vote, unless your votes are very concentrated in certain parts of the country. I mean, if 25% of your vote is overwhelmingly concentrated in 150, 200 seats, then you're going to start winning a lot of seats. But 25% in a first past the post electoral system isn't going to give you a great deal. And the other reason why I think that the Reform UK vote will fall back is for the reason that you gave in your answer. It is, I mean, their pitch in a sense is contradictory. They are doing what the Liberals used to be accused of doing in the old days, that they're conservative sounding in conservative areas of the country and Labour sounding in Labour areas of the country. And of course, Farage's stuff on the nationalisation of Scunthorpe and all of this kind of stuff is deliberately designed to play to Labour constituencies, quite apart from the fact that they offer should their manifesto commit themselves to what they've committed at their launch, such as raising the personal allowance to £20,000 at a cost, according to the IFS, of £70 billion. It could only be paid for. It could only be paid for by cuts in public expenditure of the type that have never ever been introduced in Britain before. And that would all be flushed out during the course of an election campaign. But that being said, the fact that there may well be electoral reasons, the electoral system reasons why there is a break in reform, and scrutiny reasons which will act as a break to reform, that doesn't mean that the Conservatives are still in the game, because the fact is that certainly on the right of the politics, the mood music is with reform and not with the Tories.
Yeah, absolutely. Reform are not the only challengers to the established parties, and this is true not just in Scotland but also across the UK now. And on the share of the vote enjoyed by Labour and the Conservatives at a UK level and so on, it used to be well over 80%. Some elections even more than that. The idea of any party winning 40% of the vote at a general election now seems quite fantastic. Indeed, we saw this at the most recent general election, Labour winning a thumping landslide on not much more than a third of the vote. Now, it was immensely efficiently distributed, that vote, but it does show the splintering of or the fragmentation of British politics, which is something that I think people south of the border are only beginning to come to terms with. But of course, in Scotland, we've enjoyed that fragmentation for quite a long time now, and that's partly a result of the electoral system that is used for the elections to the Scottish Parliament. But we are a multi-party place now, and so just as reform offers one, if you like, outsider, quite populist challenge to the established parties, so the Greens offer another quite populist challenge to the established parties. And there is an audience for that, an appetite for it, and so on. And it's not the case, I think, that the Greens are going to be winning 15% of the vote nationwide or even 10% of the vote nationwide, but in particular constituencies, in particular parts of the country, they can have a significant presence. again, they're for people who are disgruntled with Keir Starmer, whether that's over Gaza or economics or anything else, even occasionally over the environment, which is a less fashionable cause amongst the Green Party than you might think, but nevertheless, there are still remnants of that. The Greens offer a left-wing approach and a left-wing alternative, and they do that south of the border. And in Scotland, they offer a left-wing approach if you happen to favour independence that challenges the SNP from the left. And I think we saw that in some of the selections that have been made by the Green Party for the regional lists next year. I suppose the headline of that is that although all the other sitting Green MSPs who are seeking re-election and so on came top of the regional list selections, Maggie Chapman in the northeast and so on was demoted down to second, and so is perhaps going to be less likely to be returned next year. But there are all sorts of ruptions within the Green Party. There's a sort of split between sensibles and radicals, if one can put it that way, and being very generous perhaps in both adjectives there. But between those members of the Green Party, the Ross Greer, Patrick Harvey, Lorna Slater faction and so on, who think, well, look, we were in power with the SNP, we achieved lots of things, we advanced the Green agenda across a whole range of issues, and then you have this faction that has been challenging the likes of Patrick Harvey in Glasgow to say, well, no, you're making accommodations with the running dogs of capitalism, and we can't be having that. We need to be much, much, much more radical. What's your view of what's been happening in the Scottish Greens, Bernard?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that what we have definitively learned is that the Greens are no different from any other political party when it comes to internal division. They've always been quite good at keeping a lid on internal dissent. They probably also benefit from the fact that journalists probably don't go poking around in their affairs in the way in which they do in other political parties. But the other thing, of course, is that it's been perfectly obvious from a lot of the newspaper coverage in particular that individual members of the Green Party are briefing against one another. That's certainly something which is quite new. So what it tells you is that all political parties suffer from divisions. Some of them are political, some of them are personal. Sometimes people will seek to deselect a sitting member because they disapprove of the politics. And sometimes they will attempt to deselect a member because somebody else fancies the job, and the personal ambition of one individual comes up against the vested interests of the sitting member, who at one point obviously had personal ambition to become an MSP. So they're no different in that sense to any political party. I think what it also tells us is that although, to use your word, the more radical, perhaps the more left-wing element of the Greens have managed to make a lot of noise in terms of generating column inches. What's actually interesting is that given that most of the sitting MSPs are effectively still top of their list, I think it's reasonable to conclude from that the mainstream view within the Scottish Green Party is that the kind of strategy that was pursued by Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater and would be taken forward by Ross Greer, who looks as if he will be a co-convener, and that is to say, they wish to take the Greens into government. They don't wish to be on the sidelines, and they want to negotiate hard for things which they believe strongly in. That strategy, if one looks at the selections in any case, would appear to be vindicated.
Yeah, and now we will doubtless consider all of this in the run-up to next May's elections, and then obviously depending on the parliamentary arithmetic in the immediate aftermath of the elections too. But there are going to be certain difficulties. It seems to me in marrying the Green approach with the SNP. It seems to me that at this stage, that any kind of repeat of the formal coalition that Nicola Sturgeon struck with Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater is completely impossible. It seems to me that, but of course, strange things happen in politics, and we shall have to wait and see what happens on that front. But I find it very difficult to imagine Ross Greer and Kate Forbes sitting around the same cabinet table. Let me put it no more strongly than that.
Agreed. Agreed. But well, yeah, we shall wait and see. All will be revealed in due course. I don't know about you, but
In the fullness
fullness
of
of
time.
time. I don't know about you, but it's a very thin political news agenda. It really is. Of course, we're in the summer. Not a lot tends to happen, and of course, Westminster will be rising relatively shortly, and then we'll be into party conference season. So I think I'm going to enjoy the weather today and. Hope that one or two issues emerge in the next week in order that we've got something to talk about next week.
Well. Then this is where, Bernard, I have some bad news for you, and indeed
Ah!
for listeners everywhere, because this is our last podcast this month.
Oh.
I stress this month and so on because I am away on holiday next week, and I do not intend to be paying very much attention, or but shall we say, even less attention than is customary to what's happening in Scottish politics. So there won't be a show next week, I'm afraid, folks. But we will be back in August. So set your calendars for that. And if you're on holiday, then I hope you have a splendid time away from home as well. But for the time being, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.